All right, so we're about ready to start taking photographs, but before we do, there's a couple things that we gotta do to our camera to set it up for HDR photography. First thing, put it in manual mode. In addition to having the camera in manual mode, we're going to wanna have our white balance not be in an automatic mode either. We're outside right now, it's a daylight, so I'm gonna set my white balance in the camera to daylight. That means that each one of those bracketed photos, it's gonna have that exact same color temperature throughout all of them. In terms of the f-stop, you're going to want to set an f-stop based on your scene and how much depth of field that you want to have in it. I'm going to be using an f-stop of anywhere from f13 to f16 because I want to have a lot of depth of field in my photographs. HDR, by its nature, brings out all that texture and detail that we want in the photograph. With a higher ISO, you're going to have a lot of noise in there, and HDR is going to really make that noise stand out. So you want to shoot, 100, 200, as low as you possibly can. We're going to now bring our cameras to our tripod and we're going to connect it to a cable release. This is the ideal setup for HDR photography. A nice sturdy tripod, a cable release. If you don't have a cable release, try setting your camera on self-timer and then it'll count down and then it'll take the picture. You don't want to have your hands on the camera pushing the shutter button because you can end up moving the camera a little bit, and you want to have all three of your exposures where there's no movement in the camera between all three of them to help it align. Now in Aurora HDR, there is a way to do an alignment so that if you do have a little bit of a movement in there between photos, or if you had a hand hold it, Aurora can try and get those all together lined up, but make your life easier and just start out with keeping it on a tripod and using a cable release. The way I do my HDR photography is my middle exposure is what you would sort of be your normal average exposure. What you want to do is make sure that your camera is set up to give you those little flashing ants, the little lines that pop up on your camera that tell you that you're overexposed in certain areas. And I set up when I'm shooting to make sure that if I have just a little bit of flashing, that's okay. That is then going to be a proper exposure. It's going to be my middle exposure. And then I set up my camera to take 2 additional exposures, one that's 2 stops overexposed and one that's 2 stops underexposed. Now in my particular camera right here, I can set that up in the camera. There's a setting in there that I can do for automatic exposure bracketing, and I dial it in to take 3 different photos at +2, 0, and -2. The 2 stops underexposed is allowing our highlights to get detail in them. So any of the real bright areas, we're going to have detail and tone and color and all those. The 2 stops underexposed, that's going to allow us to get all the detail in the shadow area. The only thing left to do is just push the shutter on the cable release and it's going to fire off 3 photos right away for me. So now that I've taken those 3 photos, I'm now going to take a look at my histogram. And there's a couple things that I'm going to be looking for. I'm going to want to make sure that my middle exposure is an average histogram and the points goes to either end. Now on my overexposed photo, I'm going to see a lot of those blinky highlights because that's going to be really overexposed. And I want to make sure that my histogram is shifted enough to the right so that there's a gap going to where the darkest end is. That means I've captured enough of the tonal range in my shadow area. Now in my underexposed photo, it's going to be the opposite. That whole histogram is going to be shifted to the left, and I want to make sure I have a little bit of a gap towards the right-hand side. What that is telling me is that I got all the highlight detail that I'm going to get out of that photo. Okay, so now that I've checked my histogram in all 3 of the photos, I know now that I have a great bracketed set that is going to work perfectly inside of Aurora HDR, and I'm going to be able to create a photo that has nice shadow detail, nice highlight detail, and a nice tonal range throughout.